Hi, Lou Pulsifer here to talk about tabletop RPGs in relation to the market. Tabletop RPGs have been prisoners of modern capitalism, among other things. And the result is, except for the very largest companies, it's very difficult for any startup or any small company to have much impact on the market. Why is this? There are three parts to this imprisonment, as I call it. First, there's the economic need to constantly produce more information, but especially more rules. Second, there's saturation or oversaturation, if you prefer, of the market. And third, crowdsourcing has changed things. So let's talk about the first problem. To produce a really good popular RPG that can be played by the largest number of people, you need to do what all games are doing. Get shorter and simpler. You have to avoid crunchiness. As Deslock, the reviewer of PC Gamer magazine, called it. And that's rules that are barriers to entry, such as long character creation. If it takes an hour to create a character, then a great many people are not going to bother to play the game unless they're given characters to play with. And of course, if you're given a character to play with, you don't really care about it, so it reduces the enjoyment of the game in general. People who play RPGs frequently do so for social reasons, and they don't want to have to worry about a lot of rules. Hardcore folks who like lots of rules nowadays can play complex computer RPGs like Skyrim. They can play MMOs like World of Warcraft. They don't need to play tabletop games. However, if a tabletop RPG company wants to continue making money, they need to keep publishing more rules, settings, and adventures. Unfortunately, settings and adventures from other games can be adapted to their particular game. And we've been publishing settings and adventures a long time. So the only thing that's unique to their game is additional rules. And consequently, additional rules are published by the boatload. Well, that's the first problem. When you have so many additional rules being published, the simplicity and maybe even the quick play of the game are lost. And play balance is often ruined, as we saw with 3rd edition D&D. All of this discourages new players rather than attracts them. They have to worry about all these new rules, additional rules. It's just not worth it. 3rd edition D&D, to my mind, is an example. It often became a contest to find some set of additional rules, and there was bunches and bunches of them, that would give your character the most power and imbalance the game. Now, the game itself had the apparent object of letting players be one-man armies and letting players show off how wonderful they were or how wonderful their character was, all of which discouraged cooperation. And of course, from my point of view, I see this kind of game as a cooperative game, not a loner game. So to me, that was not interesting at all. And I think that was true for many other people, especially people who were used to 1st and 2nd edition D&D, where you had to cooperate or you were going to die. 1st and 2nd edition D&D relied on combined arms cooperation. The magic users, for example, were dead if they were caught alone. In 3rd edition D&D, magic users could function quite well when they were alone. So 3rd edition D&D became a very complex game. The stat blocks alone took a lot of time. I remember listening to people who were editors of 3rd edition D&D adventures, and it was the stat blocks that drove them crazy because they had to spend so much time checking the stat block to make sure it was right because there was so much detail in it. Now we add to this that perhaps there's a suspicion of simplicity nowadays. I don't know if this is part of the triumph of capitalism or what, but modern consumers, if they don't see a lot of complication, then for them they don't understand the effort that's involved in the game. So sometimes game designers are substituting complexity for substance. Games don't need to be complex, but they do need to be deep, or at least certain kinds of games. It's easy to make games more complex. It's easy to add things to games. Simplifying is harder. But people don't appreciate that, and if you've simplified a game, you're not going to publish additional rules, and that's what capitalism requires, additional rules. To my mind, simplicity is the goal for game designers. My motto is, a designer knows he has achieved perfection, not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And another form about Japanese gardening is, your garden is not complete until there is nothing else that you can remove. If you're making a puzzle, complexity might make sense because you're trying to make the puzzle harder, but it doesn't make sense for a game. So here we have a situation where economics defeats good game design. And for Wizards of the Coast, and before them TSR, but especially Wizards of the Coast, economics triumphed in the end, and they keep coming out with new versions. The game gets unwieldy, and finally they replace it with a new edition. And of course, once they come out with a new edition, they once again have a field day where they can produce more and more additional rules. The mistake that Wizards of the Coast made was that in 4th edition D&D, they came out with a game that was so different from previous editions of D&D that it didn't seem to be connected, and that enabled people to say, well, why should I bother with 4th edition? I'll just try some other non-D&D game. Then Paizo Publishing came out with Pathfinder, which is revised 3.5 edition D&D, and they actually overtook the sales of 4th edition and became the most popular role-playing game. So Wizards of the Coast is coming out with a 5th edition where they've come back to be closer to the 1st and 2nd editions and the 3rd edition to try to recover lost ground. Whether they will or not, who knows? So that's the first problem, this cycle of publishing more rules because they need to publish more stuff to make money, and that ruins a game, so they have to come up with a new game, and that's risky, and it also annoys the players. Now the other two problems, remember, are saturation, or if you prefer, oversaturation. Saturation means there's no more room. Oversaturation just is exaggeration of it. And also crowdsourcing. So, saturation comes from the weight of the years. Some old guy like me can remember when Dungeons and Dragons didn't exist, but that was a long time ago. As time passes, you get veteran role-playing gamers who have more and more accumulated material, settings, adventures, and stuff that can be adapted to the newer role-playing games. So they have less and less incentive to buy more settings and more adventures. Add to that, more and more of that older material is available in cheap PDF formats, such as Gary Gygax's Giants Adventures. So why buy new stuff that's more expensive as well? So lots of people who play RPGs, and I count as one, don't buy anything new, practically speaking. What's the result? It's harder to sell professionally priced settings and adventures, which leaves us with more rules. So the saturation of the market contributes to the triumph of capitalism. Then we have crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is competition from the crowd online. As an example, stock photography used to be a major way for professional photographers to make money. They'd take photographs and then they would let somebody use a photograph for a significant charge. Well, in this day and age, lots of people can shoot good photographs with digital cameras. One of the reasons why professional photographers get good photographs is not only because they know what to do, but because they shoot a whole lot of film to get a few good photographs. Those people can now upload their photographs to a stock photography site and offer them for like $1 a shot. And the professional photographers simply cannot compete with that. So crowdsourcing has more or less done away with professional stock photography. What's the situation in role-playing games? We have competition from amateurs and semi-professionals via online distribution. There are hundreds of fanboys and fangirls who just want people to see their stuff. They don't even worry if they get paid, or they'll accept very low payment. And yet the fan stuff may be better play-tested than the professional stuff because the fans are doing what they love and they're willing to take amounts of time that would be impractical for professionals. Professionals, if they want to make a living or anything close to it, cannot take time to play test. People who wrote RPG material freelance 30 years ago were paid royalties and retained ownership of the material. Now it's all work for hire, which means you don't own the material, and the rates are dire, like 2 cents a word or 5 cents a word if you're really good. Well, 2 cents a word was a really good rate in the pulp era, the 1930s, but that was equivalent to 30-odd cents now. So even a half cent a word in the pulp era was much, much more than people are being paid now. So once again, at current rates, the professionals have little incentive to spend a lot of time playtesting the material. They've got to churn out thousands of words a day. The result is there's lots and lots of cheap material out there that's as good or nearly as good as the professional stuff. So why would a smart person pay professional prices? So crowdsourcing has strongly affected the business. And these three things have led to a collapse of the market. Many companies that used to make lots of money and sell lots of role-playing game books wouldn't touch it now. I remember talking to one company that primarily produces war games. They had one particular RPG book that they sold 11,000 copies of, which is a very large number nowadays. But they would never think of trying to do it now because they would sell 1,000 if they were lucky. And of course, we can add the other reason for this collapse, which is computer role-playing games, which compete with tabletop role-playing games in a way that didn't exist in 1974-75 when D&D was in its infancy. Moreover, tabletop role-playing games require imagination and they require thinking that computer role-playing games don't really require, because you can't lose a computer role-playing game. You respawn, you go back to your save. In a way, tabletop games are doomed by the easy button of the computer. So, the market has collapsed. Now, that doesn't mean that Wizards of the Coast or Paizo Publishing can't make a lot of money, but they're relying on their reputation and their distribution system. Much smaller companies have a much more difficult time of it. So what's the current state of the market? Well, people at Gen Con who give talks about RPGs say an independent is lucky to sell 1,000 copies of an RPG book. That can't keep larger companies going. It can be a source of income for an individual who has a full-time job, but it's not anything like being able to make a living. Ask yourself how much you buy compared to years ago if you've been in the hobby for many years. And of course, recall that you're exceptional because you're listening to this screencast, and most people would not be. I buy hardly anything, and I don't have to read all the stuff that I've bought. There are new companies like Kobold, which, it has to be said, was founded by a former Wizards of the Coast employee, who succeed enough to provide a living, but most don't. and we continue to be doomed by this cycle of more rules until the edifice falls down and a new edition results, and nobody's really happy with what's going on.